we ready to start? All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining us here at this information session about the Kirtland Air Force Base fuel spill cleanup. We have a lot of information to cover tonight, and we've got a couple formats to do that, and we'll get to that in a moment. My name is Mark Kincaid. I'm with the Air Force Civil Engineer Center, and along with my partner, Jill Turner, with the New Mexico Environment Department, we'll be your facilitators tonight. We're also the folks that you want to come to if you have comments or ideas to make these information sessions better. Look for me, look for Jill. Armando Perez is also with our office. He'll be walking around taking photos, and he's going to be talking to each of you, or he's going to be talking to some of you individually, asking you your opinion and for your feedback. We want to make this an information session that works for you. But before we get too far into this, I would like to introduce the host of tonight's session, the commander of the 377th Mission Support Group at Kirtland Air Force Base, Colonel Tony Hott. Thank you, Colonel.
Good evening, everybody. I wanted to just take a few minutes to kind of set the stage before we get into the presentations, do a couple of introductions, and kind of tell you what we've been doing over the past 3 months. Since July, we've been extremely busy, and you're going to see that in the presentation tonight, and I hope that you're pleased with what you're going to hear. First of all, Mr. Kincaid alluded to the format change. You know, we've been listening to the community members, trying to make sure that we have not only a large enough venue to accommodate as many people as we possibly can, but also some of the feedback was that it was kind of hard to hear in some of our other areas. So we've got a great sound system. Hopefully it's working good tonight. Some great guys in the back that are helping us out. So we hope that's going to help out quite a bit. You know, and you may have read in the paper and seen on the news some of the things we've been doing. So one of the biggest things that has happened recently is Mr. Mark Carell, who is he's kind of the lead environmental executive for the Air Force. He came to visit. He's been here twice. He came with Secretary Ferguson not too long ago. But he also came back, and he had a very productive meeting with many government agencies, state, local, federal, over in the mayor's office. And he outlined a very aggressive course of action to handle this issue. And you're going to hear about that a little bit more here shortly, but a very aggressive plan, and he was able to get all the different agencies that have to come together to make that plan work. He got everybody, nodding in the right direction, and we're all on board and talking from the same page to make this, to attack this issue as aggressively and as smartly as we possibly can. So you'll hear about that a little bit later. We also had an opportunity, myself, some others from Kirtland, the New Mexico Environmental Department, to go and talk to the legislature and have a good dialogue with those folks with the Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. And that was a great opportunity to kind of, again, brief where we are, where we're headed, and talk about the future. And we're all very excited, I think, about where we're headed in the future. So before I do turn it back over to the folks that are going to be briefing, we have quite a few special guests with us tonight. But first and foremost, let me introduce Secretary Ryan Flynn from the New Mexico Environmental Department. He'd like to come up and say a few words, and then I'll introduce the other folks that we have here tonight. Secretary.
Thanks, Colonel. I just wanted to first and foremost thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank the Air Force for agreeing to change the format of these sessions, and appreciate their offer to continue to evaluate the format to try to get you as much information as possible. And I think that's really the theme of what we're trying to do. I really want you to be able to interact directly with the men and women who are on the ground, the scientists and engineers who are actually doing the work. And so that's the goal of the poster session, was really to allow you direct access, to talk to them, to ask questions, and to just have an opportunity to get direct feedback from those men and women. So I hope that you're able to take advantage of this evening, and as well as the breakout sessions after this meeting as well. Also wanted to really thank my staff for putting on a field trip earlier this week, and I know that a number of you here tonight were able to actually attend that field trip, that geologic field trip that occurred. But it really, again, the men and women of our staff, especially Dennis McQuillan and Steve Reuter and our entire team, worked very well with the U.S. Geological Service, as well as a number of other important stakeholders, again, to put on a day-long field trip to, again, just to try to get as much accurate information out to the public, and again, give you an opportunity to interact directly with them so you can learn more about what's going on with this project and some of the technical challenges that we face. So also want to thank, I really appreciate all the support from first of all, from our congressional delegation. I see a number of the representatives here from Senator Udall, Senator Heinrich, and Congresswoman Lujan Grisham's office, and we really appreciate your support and your attendance at all of these meetings, and we appreciate your continued support for this effort. Also want to thank all of our local officials who have been actively working on this long before I even came onto the scene. Our local mayor's office, Mayor Barry, as well as Mary Lou Leonard from the city of Albuquerque, who's sitting right up here, the Water Utility Authority, their governing board, as well as their director and their staff, and Rick Sheen is here, and they've been outstanding stakeholders who've been actively participating in this process. Also really want to thank Commissioner Maggie Hart-Stebbins. She's been really working tirelessly on this project for a number of years, and really appreciate her continued effort to keep this project moving forward. So I want to thank everyone for their involvement. I want to thank you all, the public, for actually showing up and for continuing to get yourself information and to ask questions, which we'd be happy to try to answer. And want to just once again reiterate that this is a top priority for my agency. And we've been working to really aggressively ramp up the efforts. I hear you loud and clear that you've been frustrated, that there has not been more action. I can't go back in time, but I can tell you that since the very first day I took this job, I've been pushing this project forward, and we will continue to push this project forward until we're able to defeat this plume. So I really want to make that very clear, that we're going to continue to push to aggressively remediate the spill, and these meetings tonight hopefully will again allow you to take the time to get information, because it's really important that we provide accurate information to the public so you can just educate yourselves about the risks as well as about the solutions that we're implementing. So thank you all for coming, and I'll turn it back over to Colonel Hott.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I think if I could echo the comments, I think the most important thing from my perspective is being fairly new to the Albuquerque community. I truly see this as a partnership, as Secretary Flynn alluded to. Not only the people here in the front row from all the different local agencies, state and federal, folks from the base, but everybody in this room, everybody that is in the Albuquerque community who is concerned about this issue, it's all a partnership. And I think it's important that we remember that we all have the same goals. We want to eliminate this plume. We want to eliminate this problem. We're going to keep the drinking water safe, and that's why we're here. And so it takes all of us to do that. Not any one agency can do it by ourselves. So I think that's critical. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to all the agencies that are represented. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Kincaid to continue tonight's event.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you, Secretary Flynn. Okay, we're going to go on to the main presentation in just a moment. Very quickly, something you've already heard, but I want to touch bases on it so you'll understand where we're going with this thing. We do have the poster sessions. You already saw that. And then we're going to have our technical experts tell you an update on the project. Then we have breakout sessions, and this is where you get to go talk to the experts about the issues that are important to you. You can ask questions, and more importantly, you can share information with them. We take that information back. We're going to put the questions on our website. We're going to, whatever we can answer, we will get you an answer, and we're going to share the information with everybody. Again, we will have folks around here, and you have comment cards, I believe, so please feel free to give those to us, and we'll take care of it. The next part is just the meeting guidelines. And now those of you who've been here before, you probably understand how the meeting works. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the briefing. It's going to be about 20 minutes. And I would ask you to, if you can, focus your questions and comments on what you see at the briefing, because the breakouts are there for you to share your specific questions and comments with those experts. We will be watching the time on that to give you more time with the experts. If you don't have any other questions, I think we're about ready, right? Okay, so I would like to turn it over to Dr. Adria Bador and Mr. McClellan. You good to go?
I think this is turned on. how you had us explain things to you, and we'll do this again if you want. If there are people that didn't get to attend, we can do it again. So I want to tell you something about the site history. Most of you have seen this before. I'm not going to read every bullet, but the groundwater contamination dissolve phase was discovered in 2001. Whoops. Going backwards. And soil vapor extraction began in 2003. To date, we've recovered more than 500,000 gallons of fuel from soil vapor extraction alone. A 500,000 gallon spill would be huge if it was reported to us today. Questions have been asked about how much was released. We don't really know. I can tell you we've recovered 500,000 gallons, and there's a lot more left in the ground. So this was a huge spill. A lot has happened, as Colonel Hott has said, in 2014, and we're going to talk to you about some of that tonight. I want to tell you that the monthly testing of the public water supply wells that's ongoing, there have been no detections of any type of fuel-related contamination. We're testing these on a monthly basis. We've also brought in experts. We have to understand the chemical and the physical and the biological processes that are influencing this contamination plume, because we may want to take advantage of some of those processes. We have to understand what the bacteria are doing, what the chemistry is doing, and the physics. We've done some tests that have never been done before, and we have some data to show you tonight that I think you'll find very interesting. We're also filling data gaps. We're going to be putting 15 new wells, 5 well nests with 3 wells each in the north and east, because we don't have such good coverage up there. We're ramping up the robustness of the interim measures, particularly the soil vapor extraction. And we have a proposal now that has not been seen yet in the history of the site, an aggressive proposal to go in and collapse the EDB plume, and Adria is going to tell you about that. So let me tell you something very briefly, and those of you who were on the field trip saw some of this about your basin. Albuquerque is in the Middle Rio Grande Basin, which is a very large structural basin that extends from La Bajada Hill all the way down into Socorro County. And this basin was created by faulting on the east and faulting on the west. And it's like the state's being pulled apart, and this big keystone chunk of rock fell down in the middle and has been filled in by the Rio Grande and its tributaries with sand and gravel and clay. That's the Middle Rio Grande Basin. This sedimentary basin is also a major aquifer system. So you can see the outline of the basin right in here. How deep does it go? So the next slide I'm going to show you is a survey of gravity anomalies. And if you measure very subtle differences in gravity, areas like the Sandia Mountains that have dense rock like granite come out high. Those are going to show up as red. And the basin fill is less dense because it's gravel and sand, and it shows up in blue. Well, here's the KFB fuel site in the basin. Here's the gravity survey. Here's the outline of the basin. You can see a gravity high in the Sandia Mountains, and you can see the gravity lows within the basin. And so here you can see that there's actually 3 sub-basins within the Middle Rio Grande Basin. The Santo Domingo sub-basin, Calabasas, that's the one that you were in here in Albuquerque, and the Belen sub-basin. And so the deepest part of the basins are where it's darkest blue and purple. So what does this look like? If you slice the earth open in a cross-section, there's the fuel spill on that gravity map. This is an artist rendition. Now we have more detailed geologic cross-sections in the poster session, but this is a really good artist rendition of this basin. If you were to cut it open and look at it to the north, we have the fault system, the Sandia Mountains. We have faults on the west over by the Rio Puerco. And we have this basin fill material, which is actually very complicated. It's gravel, sand, clay, and some of that has been faulted. And you can see the water table right in here. So Albuquerque is very fortunate. You're sitting on a huge reservoir of groundwater. And most of this groundwater in the upper couple thousand feet is fresh water. So you have a vast reservoir of water. Here's the fuel spill over in the east area. Now at the July meeting, there was a lady who asked me if this fuel spill was going to contaminate her well, her private domestic well, and she lived in Corrales. Corrales is over here. And we have people on the West Mesa. The fuel spill is of concern to the public supply wells that are in the immediate vicinity, but it does not threaten wells that are in Corrales, that are on the West Mesa, that are in Tijeras Canyon up in here. It doesn't mean it's not important in terms of protecting the public wells in the area, but this is a really big aquifer. Most of the contamination is within the upper layer of this aquifer as well. And some people who have nitrates in their water on the West Mesa from septic systems have drilled deeper to get good water. So unlike areas like Cloudcroft, where they are sitting on a fractured rock that tends to go dry every summer and they have to haul water in, you guys are sitting on a big reservoir. And it doesn't mean there's lots of water, we don't have to clean it up and protect it. It means we have to protect it because it's such a precious resource. But I want you to appreciate the resource you have here in the middle part of the state. Now, one of the things that we see in this basin in terms of the water pressures and the water levels, if you drill 3 wells right next to each other, and you can put them in the same borehole or three different wells next to each other, and you measure the water level inside them. This is the Trumbull piezometer nest that the USGS drilled. These were the water levels on June 20th of this year. The water level across the water table was at this elevation, 4861. You can see the elevation of the bottom of the hole here. So as we drilled deeper, the deeper wells had higher water levels. And there was almost 20 feet over 900 feet or so of difference. And this is evidence of what's called vertical hydraulic gradients. It means that the water down here is under some type of artesian pressure, and there are clay layers. I didn't put these in because there's not one layer, there's actually stacks of layers. It's really complicated. But these clay layers are confining these deeper zones. And this is good for protecting water supply wells because the city wells pump from this area down here. And so if there's a hydraulic connection between the shallow zone where there's contamination and the deep zone where the wells pump, the water's going to tend to move up instead of down. Now, the relation between these two can change in the summer. Sometimes the water level in this intermediate well is lower. So it doesn't guarantee protection, but it's certainly working in our favor. So the takeaway on the hydrogeology is that you guys are sitting on an extremely precious body of water. It's extremely high quality. There's a lot of it, and it needs to be protected. It's only the uppermost part of the water that gets contaminated, either by septics or fuel or whatever. We're looking at the wells that are right in the immediate vicinity of the plume. They have to be watched very carefully, but it does not threaten wells in other areas of the basin. So here's a cartoon of LNAPL, which is just a scientific name for oil, light non-aqueous phase liquid, but you'll hear this term used. The oil gets released into the soil, it begins migrating down. And so we have a body of oil that's in the soil, the unsaturated zone. And then when that oil hits the water table, it's light, it floats on top of it. It doesn't really look like a pancake, it looks more like an iceberg. And then you have volatile constituents coming off this LNAPL in a soil vapor phase. And then the water-soluble hydrocarbons dissolve into the water and move with the flow of water. And there's actually a 4th phase called the soil phase or the adsorb phase. Some of the contaminants will actually attach themselves to the clay particles in the soil. So we're dealing with a 4-phase system: the LNAPL, the oil, the vapor, the soil or the adsorb phase, and the dissolve phase. And it's the dissolved EDB which is driving the risk for the site in terms of those threats to the water supply wells. Now, what we've observed is that the natural bacteria that live in the aquifer have been biodegrading some of the constituents in this fuel with no human intervention whatsoever. And this is nothing, for hydrocarbons, this is nothing profound, nothing unusual. I've looked at dozens, maybe 100 or more sites with fuel across the state. This happens in every site. And so we're basically feeding the bacteria hydrocarbons. The benzene is like pizza to them. And when they eat this fuel, they generate carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide transforms into alkalinity in the groundwater. So here's the LNAPL plume right in here. This solid red is the dissolved benzene plume. And this is the area of elevated groundwater alkalinity. This is the byproduct of biodegradation when the bacteria consume hydrocarbons. That's good. We want to have these bacteria, we want to take full advantage of the processes that are going on. Now let's look at the EDB plume. It's about the same scale, but you can see that the dissolve phase of EDB is much larger than the footprint for the benzene. And that's because there's been far less biodegradation of EDB. EDB is extremely water soluble and it's far less degradable. But and Adria is going to talk about some of the mechanisms of degradation, but a lot of the mechanisms of degradation will release the bromide ion, which is a salt. It's an ion that goes into the groundwater. So one of the things we did this year is we tested for bromide in the groundwater. And there's an area right in the core of the plume, right where the benzene is, right where the alkalinity, the high alkalinity, we have elevated bromide that's higher than in the wells surrounding. So this is some pretty compelling evidence that EDB is biodegrading. Now I want to temper that statement by saying that it looks like the EDB is only biodegrading in the presence of biodegrading hydrocarbons. And it's only occurring under anaerobic conditions, which is pretty much right in this area. The EDB has moved way beyond there, and as far as we can tell, there's little or no, probably no degradation of EDB once it moves beyond that hydrocarbon area. And that's why Mr. Carell and Adria have proposed this system to pump and extract to collapse the EDB plume, because we need more than what the bacteria have done for us. So the takeaway on this is that both the hydrocarbons and EDB have degraded to some extent. But this natural degradation alone is not going to take care of the problem. However, we want to take full advantage of these biological processes. And if there's a way we can slip a little ice cream into the pizza that these bacteria are eating and get them to consume more of this, then that's a good thing. So one of the things that Adria will tell you about are the microcosm, these laboratory tests, and we're going to find out what they like to eat, what processes they are using, and see if there's a way that we can stimulate the native bacteria to do a better job in that core area. We still have to collapse the dissolve phase because there's no way we're going to bioremediate that. So we're looking at different treatment systems for different areas of the plume. So the priorities for us, first and foremost, we have to protect the water supply wells. That is at the top of our priority list. You've heard it from the leadership, the management. We have to protect the water supply wells. And we're going to tell you how we're doing that. We want to collapse that dissolve phase of EDB that is not biodegrading. And then we have to go after that oil that's in the water. The oil used to be floating on the water table. Thanks to all your water conservation efforts, which is a good thing, the water level rose. And that trapped that floating oil underneath the water table. And this has greatly complicated the task of cleaning this up. And Adria will tell you about what we're considering in the way of doing that. And we're going to continue to vacuum the soil over by where the spill was. There's still a lot more fuel left in there. That's been going since 2003, and it's going to be ramped up and made even more robust in the near future. So how are we protecting the drinking water wells? Well, we have to obviously clean up the plume, and we are doing monthly monitoring of all the public wells in the area. The federal law only requires testing for EDB in benzene once every 3 years. The base commander has ordered that this be done on a monthly basis. We've also drilled what are called sentinel wells around the water supply wells. Here's the VA well, which is the closest to the plume. And we have well nests of 3 wells each that are positioned between the supply well and the contamination. So if the plume starts moving towards the supply well, it'll provide early detection. And I'm really happy to tell you that these wells right here are all clean. It's kind of remarkable that this well is so close to the plume, but the plume has moved right beyond the VA well and has not been sucked into it, probably because the pumping from these wells overwhelms the effect of the VA well. But it's being tested monthly nonetheless. More sentinel wells are being put in. For those of you who are on the field trip on Tuesday, the well that we saw going in is this one right here. That's the one that the USGS is drilling right now. The drill cuttings are out there at the poster session, and there will be more wells going in. These are the new sentinel well, or the new data gap wells that are going to be drilled. The rig will be mobilized, I think, in November of this year, within weeks. And you can see we don't have such good coverage in this direction. We need to fill those data gaps in. There's the names of the supply wells. Kirtland number 16 is not being used right now. but we're keeping a close eye on the VA well and the others that are in the immediate area, monthly testing. None of these wells have shown any detections. And these are proposed new Sentinel wells. So the takeaway on the drinking water protection, there has been some confusion about what the standard is. New Mexico has exactly the same drinking water standard as the federal government, and that's 0.05 micrograms per liter. Federal law requires testing once every 3 years. We're testing monthly. We've had no detections in any of the supply wells out there. The EPA, the federal government, has established regulatory detection limits, and they've prescribed 3 methods that you can use to test for EDB, and they have a nominal detection limit of 0.01, which is less than the standard. This different from the quantitation level. We can talk about that if you want in the breakout sessions. And we're putting in the Sentinel wells to provide early detection. So that's the takeaway message for how we're protecting the public water supply wells. And the bottom line is that the dissolved EDB is not going to be allowed to impact any drinking water supply system. We're committed to that. That's been my assignment from Secretary Flynn, Adria's assignment, and that's what we've been told to do. Now Adria is going to talk about the cleanup measures.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Okay, so as Dennis was pointing out, we have 4 priorities that we're working on simultaneously right now. And this is the second priority and the biggest priority for us, because this is the driver for this site, is the EDB and collapsing this EDB. And so there's been a lot of discussion when I first came here in July about what is the plan. And so we're going to talk about the plan. The plan is looking at it in 3 phases. Phase 1 basically is this first phase to put in the first extraction well to start pumping contaminated EDB water and treating it for the first time at this plume. And then the second phase of this plan is to expand that system to fully collapse the plume and bring it back onto the base. And so that is the second phase. And the third phase of this plan is basically, you don't just install a system and leave it. You've got to optimize it, make sure it's being monitored, check to see how the system is functioning, and decide whether it's not reaching the goals that you want it to do. And if so, make those adjustments. So that's our 3-phase plan for collapsing the EDB plume. So to get us back to sort of the orientation, so this is right now the outline of the EDB plume. And what I want to point out here is that the different colors that you're seeing here, this is orange. These were the wells that were installed from 2000 to 2010. And then the dark green are wells that were installed from 2010 to 2012. And then out here, these light green ones were installed in late 2012. And now we're basically planning on, forwards, doing new wells because we know that there are data gaps that we need to fill. The first one that we're going to do is we need to understand the true depth of this contamination. And out here in this portion of the plume, we did not have the vertical extent. So how deep did that EDB plume go? And so that's the first thing that we're doing in this data gaps. We're going to basically drill a deeper well in this area. Because we know that in this area, the well that we have the deepest there is still above the MCL. And because it's above that 0.05 limit, we know that we haven't reached the bottom. Ooh, I'm hearing more. The next thing that we're going to do, wrong way, is to do 5 more clusters of wells. These, again, are going to be done in 3s. The first one is in the shallow. Dennis had pointed out that's where our contamination is. We have one in an intermediate in the groundwater and one in the deeper portion of that. And so we're going to install another 15 wells out here to also fill in this data gap. When you look at this plume right now as it's drawn, it's based on data from this well and data from this well. So it's kind of skewed. We don't know, and we need to find out exactly what's happening here so that we fully understand the extent of this plume. And so that's what we're trying to do here. So the first phase is this extraction well. And so what we've got is this extraction well is going in this area where I was talking about where we had higher concentrations. And we picked this extraction area because in the shallow zone, we noticed the EDB was rising in that. We also noticed in the intermediate was also rising. And so that kind of is a worrisome sign. Plus, we also knew we don't have the vertical extent here. So by drilling that deeper well first, we'll understand that and we'll design this extraction well to capture all of that zone of contaminated water. That's the plan. The next part of this is we're going to pump up the water and bring it over to a treatment facility. And this is going to be on base, as you can see, and then we're going to have construction, obviously, going out here underneath Louisiana, coming down Louisiana, and coming onto the base. If you're familiar with the base, this is actually the old housing community area where the pump and treat system will actually be done. And then after it comes out of the pump and treat, it's going to go to an infiltration gallery at this point for this system. And so this is our phase one and what we have planned, and this is all going to be going and starting in November, as we were talking before. The first part of it is installing these data gaps, and then we'll be installing the extraction well and this whole system. So all spring, you're going to see construction and things along those lines, all for treating and the starting phases of collapsing this plume. So phase two of this, this basically is where we're gonna, here's that original extraction well. The next part of this is expanding this pump and treat system. And we know, based on some modeling and some understanding, that we're gonna need to install up to 7 more additional extraction wells out here. And those will be all plumbed into this current system that will be here. So all, and this is just a schematic. We don't know exactly where these are all going to be placed. That's going to be based on data that we obtained from phase one and the USGS wells that are being installed for Sentinel wells. So this is the takeaway message. The concept here is that we really want to collapse this plume on itself. Instead of dragging the plume along to a pump and treat system, we're going to bring it back on itself and collapse it towards the base. This is probably the most efficient way to do this, and we think that this will be the fastest way to do this at this time. The other thing that has to be considered, and things that we're thinking about for future use, is this is a lot of water that we're going to be extracting, and this is a precious resource. I want to reiterate that we understand that and respect that. And part of what we're going to work on for some of this water reuse, besides an infiltration gallery, is reusing this portable water. We've got irrigation, we've got dust suppression needs on the base, and these are important things that we want to consider for this water use while we have to extract it and treat it until we can shut down this system in the future. So remediating this, the third priority that was on our list was remediating the El Napo portion of the plume. And this is what I would say is where the tricky part gets started, and where I would say the science and the geeky part is going to come out of me now. And if I speak up here, I'm going to try to bring it down, not because it's that difficult, but it's more that I want to get out to you the concepts here and what we're trying to get across. These terms are going to start coming up in the next future public meetings, and I want you to start getting comfortable with them because we're going to be discussing them a lot and how we're going to plan to remediate the El Napo portion of the plume. As Dennis had pointed out, the El Napo has been drowned, and I'm going to show you some graphics associated with that. And so that is going to play a part in how we kind of go forward and making a successful remedy for the El Napo portion of the plume. So first of all, Dennis pointed out there's naturally occurring processes and degradation is happening, and it's very common to see, as he called it, the pizza, is basically microorganisms love to eat this, and they produce, with a little oxygen, some nutrients, they eat it, and they basically, expel CO2 and water and cell mass, because with all this pizza that we've got down there, There are a lot of growing microorganisms going on down in this system right now. So those are biological processes that we're going to be looking at remediating the El Napo portion. The other part is non-biological. So this chemical, physical aspects that may be happening in the aquifer that's also treating this El Napo portion of the plume. And so we're going to be looking at that. And all of this is so that we can take advantage of this remedial approaches so that we can figure out which one is the process that's dominating and how can we take advantage of that going forward in remediating this site. So this is the nerdy part of me coming out of me, so forgive me for this. But there are basically, when you're looking at the biological processes, there are three things that we can look at. There's oxygen-driven process, which is bacteria can utilize that pizza as a food source, and they produce that CO2, water, and cell mass that I talked about. And that happens a lot with the BTEX compounds, so benzene, toluene, all of the constituents that are part of the El Napo that we've been talking about. The other way bacteria can basically degrade is under anaerobic conditions, and this is called reductive debromination. Don't fear that, it's just a fancy word. But basically, this is where we remove those bromide off of the carbons of the EDB, so ethylene dibromide. And what's happening here is there are certain bacteria, just like we use oxygen, they can actually utilize this under anaerobic conditions and expire bromide. And so we believe that this is another process that can be playing a role in this El Napo portion of the plume. The third part is what's called co-metabolism. And so this is where we have bacteria who can utilize this food source, but they don't actually get a benefit from it. It's sort of they produce an enzyme that actually can degrade the EDB, but they don't get any desired effect from it. So it's not their goal in life, it just happens to be a sort of a byproduct of something that they're doing. And so there's a way that we can probably take advantage of co-metabolism, and that may be another process that's happening biologically in the El Napo portion. The next part is these abiotics. So this is the non-biological, the physical, chemical ways of processes. And so I'm going to touch on two that possibly could be playing a role out here. One is reactive minerals. These reactive minerals are things like iron sulfides. They they're very similar in that they reductive debrominate the compound, so you get your ethene and your bromide. And so we think this is a process that's actually occurring here by some of the signs of looking at the mineralogy or some of the geology and the what's going on with the iron and the sulfate. There's signs that this kind of activity is also happening at the site. Another process is hydrolysis, and this is basically reaction with water. Water actually can break down compounds. In the case of EDB, the half-life is 18 years, so that's not quite fast, obviously. Looking at that, we wouldn't want to rely on an 18-year process. However, when you're in the presence of sulfide, and when you're also in the elevated temperatures, this half-life can be less than a day, okay? And that is something we can maybe take advantage of if this is a dominant process that we might want to influence the El Napo portion degradation. Again, this products are bromine and ethylene glycol, and this can be readily done under anaerobic and aerobic conditions, so with oxygen, without oxygen. So these abiotic and biotic processes are some of the things that we're looking at mechanistically for what may be happening right now in the El Napo portion. And it sounds really geeky, but the thing with this is that it helps us understand how to look at this option as a potential way to clean up this site. So in this situation, we've been looking at bioremediation option. And so we've got laboratory studies going. This is one of the techs doing. She's taking extractions and injecting things into these microcosm bottles that you see here. And we're going to be looking at these processes that we just talked about, both under oxygen conditions and without oxygens. And we're going to get expected results early in 2015. And so this data is going to help us drive and ramping up a pilot test of the direction that we want to go in based on how these results come out. So that's some really exciting things going on there. The second option is adding air. This is air sparging. So when you add air, this is currently, we have one operating right now, an air sparging unit. And we're expecting to get results again late in December and the beginning of January. So the next time we're here and we're giving our public meeting in January, we're going to have definitely some new information about how these pilot tests are running and what direction we think we're heading towards in some of these ways to clean up the El Napal portion of the plume. So we're also looking at ramping up a bigger pilot study with 3 air sparging wells to target this dissolve phase and El Napal zone that we're talking about. So these are all those things, and down here are schematics of some of the designs that would be done to do this type of work. So we talked about this drowning El Napal. This portion basically is looking at this. This is a core of soil at the site. And what is happening here is this is visually what the core looks like. And then we put it under UV light, and it fluoresces the organics present in this sample. And what you're seeing here in this fluorescent blue is all of the El Napal that is present inside the soil column that's at the site. This is a core from the site. And what happens is here's that water table. And if you notice, the water table lines up here. So this is where the aquifer water table is for this. And all of this El Napal has now gotten drowned. So this is going to complicate our remediation efforts here. And that is why we need to look at all of those processes that I was talking about before to figure out what is the best mechanism that we're going to be able to do to remediate this. This is complicated. It hasn't prevented us from treating this, but it's definitely made it a little bit more complicated. So all of the takeaway messages here. We've got a rising water table. That's a great thing for you guys from a conservation effort. Yay. You guys have done an awesome job, and I mean that sincerely because I have seen a lot of conservation efforts where the water table is still going down instead of reversing. So applaud yourself that the city of Albuquerque is doing such a great job in this area. But this is also going to be a long-term source of that dissolve phase contamination. It's going to make it a little bit tricky, and we're going to have to work really hard to figure out what's the best path forward. We're exploring in situ bioremediation as an option. We're exploring air sparging. And we are going to really take a close look at all of these natural bacteria that are doing all this degradation, trying to figure out what is the dominant process. Is it biological? Is it chemical and physical? Which one can we take advantage of? And how can we engineer a bioremediation to accelerate this cleanup and take advantage of this, but kind of kick it up a notch and move it in a faster direction? So those are the things that we're going to be working on. The next and the last priority that we had on our list was the soil vapor, the source area, and continuing soil vapor extraction. And so the thing that we've got going on here is that we're going to have new SVE wells installed this fall and in the winter and early January time period, where we're going to install clusters of SVE wells to vacuum up that El Napal portion and that vadozone portion of the soil column. And during these new wells, we're going to collect soil cores, and we're going to do a lot of techniques here to really start to look at those mechanisms that I was talking about before so that we can take advantage of this data and utilize this data in a way to help us better understand a path forward for the El Napal treating of the plume. And then we're going to perform vapor tests to basically understand how we can expand this system and the destruction rate of this system. Currently, the system is 90 pounds per hour that we're going to possibly go up to 1,500 pounds per hour. That's how much we might end up towards for doing these efficiency pilot testing that we're going to continue this next 6 months. So the takeaway, Dennis pointed out that we've already extracted 500 gallons of thank you, 500,000. I'm thinking of millions in my head. And so it's obviously been successful, but we've got more work to do here, and that's what we're working on. We're going to increase the system out here, and all of this is going to be in accordance with the city of Albuquerque and the air permitting requirements associated with this system. So this is where we're going with the SVE. So the recap, we had 4 priorities that we really wanted to make sure that you understand that both NMED and the Air Force and all of our stakeholders are kind of all on the same page about what we're trying to move forward with. We want to protect the drinking water supply. We want to basically collapse this EDB plume that's dissolved out there that's closest to these drinking water supply wells and get rid of that EDB plume and pull it back to the base. We need to remediate the El Napo portion of the plume, and we've got a lot of work there to do, but we're going to make a lot of progress, I think, in the next year or so. And then we're going to expand the SVE and the footprint of that source area and clean up that source area so less stuff can drain down into the back into the groundwater at that point. So with that being said, going back to the meeting guidelines. Oh, I'm on.
You're on. I'm not on.
You're on? Okay, I have no idea. I thought I knew.
You've had it before.
Teach us.
All right, we're not gonna do that. We'll use this one.
Lord.
Everybody's awake, right?
Right, now you're awake.
Carl's giving me, get away from the other microphone.
I don't know, maybe.
Don't sit with us.
I'll stay over here. Get in your corner.
You may want to leave yours on because you're president.
Right, well, that's why I thought.
Well, here's the deal. These 2 microphones are working, okay? So if you would, please, come up to, there you go, you're gonna need this, I'll set the clock up. And come up to the microphone.
So before we move, I just want to explain all this project, I don't know the microphone necessarily. So, apparently we need to put together another technical working group on sound system. So what we'd like to do is if you have filled out a comment card and you want us to read that instead of coming up to the mic, if you want to send those to the sides, we'll come
Hi, I'm Representative Cheryl Williams Stapleton, and I have a brief, quick question, and that is in regards to the report on the Lenape drowning, and you said that it was going to be more difficult for the treatment. How more difficult did you mean that, and what does that entail?
Okay, I'm going to check. I think I put this on mute. Okay, good, it worked. All right. So that's a very good question. So what it means by being a little bit more difficult, can you, oh no, you guys are, never mind. I was going to say, let's go back to that photo, but that's okay. Yeah. Right there, 29. Huh? Yep, this is the exact one I want. So what this means is that one of the ways you would treat this normally, the first thing you would do is because usually the El Napol is floating up here, you would use what they call skimmers or vacuum. And they literally would suck up the free product. And in actuality, at sites that I have at other locations, we've actually resold that fuel. It was good to resell it. And utilize it for other things. In this case, what has happened is we actually did try to do skimming and vacuuming up of the El Napol. It wasn't super successful. It only got about 100 gallons after 6 months of trying to do that. And at the same time that we did that, and that was actually in 2007, in 2009 is when the conservation efforts started. And at that time, and about 2010, we started to see rising water table. And what has happened now is all of that free product that was up here is now gotten trapped in the soil particles. And that trapped means that it may be in parts that are not very soluble, like I can't get air. If I want to use air to treat it, or if I want to push some kind of substance in there to kind of push up in between it won't get in contact with it. And if it doesn't get in contact with it, I have trouble with the effectiveness of it. I can do it until the cows come home, but it won't be very effective. It may preferentially treat some areas, but I will be left with huge sections that are not getting treated. And so I've got to have to overcome that problem as I go forward. Does that help?
The last part of my question was how.
How? How would I treat this?
Yeah, how would you get it that since you can't reach that far?
It's not that we can't reach that far. We can reach that far. The question is what will be the most successful thing I can do that I can treat that completely and effectively. So that if I treat this in the way of, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this, without using super technical terms. Oops, I think that's me. Dennis, are you? There? Is that where you want? Okay.
That's one option.
Right. That's one option, is to sparge it with oxygen. Another option, if you go back to the one that's before this, is a bioremediation. So using those microorganisms to our advantage. So getting them to do it even faster than what they've been doing it is another process. So we would create basically a zone of reaction using biologically driven microorganisms that are naturally in the system, that are already doing the job, but we would kind of help them, enhance them to do it better. So those are two ways to do that right now, to treat that El Napol. Even if it's drowned or not drowned, that would still be two options to treat that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to jump in here and read one of the comment cards that we have. So this question is, how soon will the proposed wells at the leading edge of the plume be operational? In other words, when will they
Come online?
Come online. What
Okay, so the first set of wells that we're going to install, and the question may be confusing two things, so I'll try to give clarity. One is we're installing up to 16 new monitoring wells. So those are not going to be operational other than we stick the well into the ground and they'll be operational that we can take a sample from so that we know the concentration of the EDB in those areas. Those are these wells here. As for the operational part, if you're talking about the extraction well, this well and this whole treatment train and everything associated with it will be installed and operational by June of 2015. That's the goal we're working for this first phase.
The next 8 months.
Yep.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kurt Krumperman. I live in Notteville. The question I had is sort of building on that. It was like 6 or 7 wells that are going to be drilled to extract and treat and pump, or pump and treat the EDB. You talked about collapsing it back to the base. Does that mean there's still some left? And what's your estimate if you're building these 7 pump and treat systems? What's your estimate
For
in
those
terms of
wells?
length of time? Will it all be constructed, and how long will they be in operation?
Okay, so like the previous drawing, that extraction, can you go back to that? I'm sorry, Lisa. I'm messing with you too much. This one, this is fun. So this pump and treat system, a couple of things that we're doing with just this one extraction well, which will actually help with the expansion of the system. So this conveyance line, so that we do not have to drill this a second time or do things along those lines, this is going to be large enough for the capacity of the full system that we're talking about. So up to 8, total 8 wells, okay? Those additional 7. So this is going to be able to hold that, carry all the water that is contaminated from all the different wells that we would install up and down gradient can be connected into this, and that can carry that volume of water. So that's one thing. This treatment plant here, that plant in the building, the way it's being designed, it is going to be large enough to treat all of this extracted water. So again, the idea here is that if we build this big now, then we don't have to tear it down or add to it when we expand the system. So this is going to be big enough to house all of the tanks and the granulated activated carbon vessels, which are also tanks that treat the contaminated water. This is going to have half of the treatment process in there. So it can treat 400 gallons per minute of water here. And then the infiltration gallery also is going to be in a situation where we can snap into and expand this for the expansion too. So getting into the timeline associated with this, we are phase 2 right now for this expansion up to these 7 more wells. We're actually contractually working that right now. So we are going to be soliciting and getting proposals in and doing that work through the next couple of months, and we hope to have a new contract in place next spring. And then that new contractor will start working on this design for this collapsing of this plume. I don't know if that answered his question. Where are you? Did that answer it?
Pretty close. When do you expect all 7 to be done? Would that be 2015, 16, 17?
So the way we have it right now is we're going to bring on 3 more wells by the September of 2015. And so now you'll have 4 functional extraction wells, and then we will probably bring on the next 4 about a year later, maybe a little bit less than that.
Okay. So we'll go back over to this side here.
Thank you. My name's Nancy Burse. I'm with the Neighborhood Association as well as District 6 coalition of 16 neighborhoods here. One of the things that has been of growing concern that I'm hearing about is, and since you've been talking about it for several meetings now, has been this idea of encouraging the bacteria to eat the pizza, if you will.
Right, right.
And the concern is that that's going to be a very delicate balance because we don't want anything else that is going to add contamination or other processes that could be damaging to our environment. And since, of course, this is a very heavy populated part of town, there's lots of people that are concerned about that. So when you talk about bacteria that you want to look at how you're going to encourage them, can you kind of give us an idea or talk about how do you encourage bacteria that are already breaking up the bromide and some other things without introducing new chemicals, new spills, new hazards, air quality issues that'll again be on top of what we're already dealing with?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So bacteria, in the case of what we're talking about right now, are degrading this contaminant to non-toxic components right now is what we're talking about. So they call that, there's mineralization, where it's complete mineralization of the contaminant to non-toxics. In the case of what we're talking about and enhancing it, if we added, say, okay, so right now we know that this anaerobic portion of the plume is degrading these contaminants right now under anaerobic conditions pretty good, especially the EDB, which is the major risk driver that's creating this big long plume here. And so what we would like to do is we also know that we would like them to maintain this, right? Because we've got them working in the right direction. We want to make sure we can maintain that and enhance that. So the way we would do that is if we added a substrate to the system, we would add something like a food source like lactate, okay? Or we would add vegetable oil that is the same, vegetable oil that we use to cook with in our homes kind of thing. That would be a type of substrate that you might inject into this ground to keep that anaerobic zone kind of cooking in the way we want it to provide those basic, simple pizza pieces, if we want to keep calling it that they can eat it, you know what I mean? Because one of the things about NAPL or this contaminant is there's all kinds of components of it. It's not one piece to it. When you talk about fuel in general, it can have 10,000 different compounds in it. And so some of those compounds are lightweight and some of them are heavier. And the heavier ones are harder to degrade. They can be degraded, they just take more time and they have to have more energy in that. And so for example, if we want to keep that moving along, so the things that we would want that may be a limiting source, another thing if we wanted to keep that anaerobic zone by adding this lactate or vegetable oil type of thing, is also other nutrients like nitrate. Now, however, nitrate is it's high here, so we probably are not going to need to do that. Some sites I've done that. What I can tell you about bioremediation or enhanced in situ bioremediation is that it can be very, very successful. It can also, sometimes we can over-engineer it. And in the past, when we've applied the technology, the concerns that you're talking about or talked about initially there, those are problems we had when we started this technology 15 years ago. In the infancy of this technology, we didn't necessarily apply it the best, and we made some mistakes associated with that. And I would say that now that this remediation technology has advanced in the last 15 years, that we can take those lessons learned and not apply them to make this worse, but to make it better.
If I could add one thing, we're already adding oxygen to the system in the sparging pilot test that we have. And that's a pretty innocuous thing. And that's going to stimulate the processes that use oxygen. And that's going to be pretty harmless. We don't really expect any negative consequences from that, except for maybe interfering with this anaerobic process. So we're going to keep a very close eye on the groundwater chemistry as this experiment proceeds. We're going to be doing anaerobic tests, and we're going to be doing aerobic tests. But introducing oxygen can be a very beneficial thing.
And I think one other thing I'd add too is that we're talking about a pilot scale. We're talking a fairly small scale initially for us to try out this process, to try this pilot test. And if in that process, we're going to have a lot of monitoring aspects of that, to look at the geochemistry, to look what's happening. If we happen to see that something isn't operating, the way it should be, that is a red flag, and obviously letting us know it'll be data driven basically, and telling us this is not the way we're going to go, because there is a problem with it. Or maybe we also do the technology, this is very possible, we could do a treatability study and it may not get the desired results we expect. Meaning we go in, we're hoping it's going to do all this degradation, it comes out the other end and that degradation is not successful. That's why you do these pilot scales and not go straight to a full-scale system right away. We want to try it first. If it doesn't work, then we know this is not the path forward for where we would go ultimately for the corrective measure at this site. Did I answer all your questions?
You did. It made me think, and Dennis talked to it about. So is some of that pilot testing built into some of the extra wells you're drilling, or how do you go about keeping your eye on that?
When any pilot test, just like we have the monitoring well network that we have to monitor, when we do these treatability studies, that when we work on the work plan, we have performance aspects of that. And we're measuring that, either monthly, quarterly, it depends on what we set up for that particular study, but we will definitely have all of those tests in play, for sure.
So I think we're going to head over to that side. And then in the interest of time, too, we also want to be respectful of the folks that are here that maybe don't necessarily want to ask a question. Again, we've got more opportunities if you want to have more of a dialogue with Adria or Dennis or some of our other... What's that?
Got it.
Slightly shorter answers. So we actually have had people waiting over on this side as well. I want to go back and forth.
I came up here with something else in mind, and I'll address that. But I thought I heard a lot of talk about degradation occurring under anaerobic conditions, and just a while ago, I lost it in all the words there. I thought I heard introducing oxygen, which obliterates the anaerobic conditions. Correct. You might think of addressing that just a little bit. But anyway, for too long, I think that this problem has been defined as a District 6 area problem or something like that. I'm from the West Side. I represent a neighborhood association. I'm also associated with the West Side Coalition. And we're starting to look at this as a very scary problem because of the way the water is distributed in Albuquerque. And maybe you can address the water distribution. I know I heard you say that Corrales and the West Mesa don't have to worry about the plume. But the way the water is distributed, I think we do. The second thing is, what I haven't heard is I've heard all the good things that are about to happen. What is the worst case scenario for the aquifer? I've not heard anybody talk about that, and I think it needs to be addressed.
Let me first talk about the statement that I made about I was talking about the people.
Can't hear you.
Sorry. Well, I'll just talk loud. My statement about the West Side and Corrales were for people who have private domestic wells in those areas. The lady at the July meeting had a well in Corrales. Now, if the EDB gets into the drinking water system, you're right, it can be distributed to other areas. But we're going to do everything we can to keep it out of those wells. And the water utility will shut wells down in the unlikely event that contamination is detected. And then And with regard to the aerobic and anaerobic processes, both aerobic and anaerobic processes have been at work on this plume. The aerobic processes are more effective on degrading hydrocarbons very rapidly, and we were fortunate that in the conditions of the aquifer before the spill, we had a very high level of dissolved oxygen. And it looks like we had some elevated nitrate as well. And these are two conditions that were very favorable for the degradation of hydrocarbons. However, as I think most of you know, the EDB degrades only under anaerobic conditions, so it's a really sticky issue.
Okay, and just one follow-up. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just one follow-up. If you have to shut down more than 1, 2, 3 wells in a worst-case scenario, what do you aim to do about that? You can only shut so many wells because, you know, you've got a west side that's got a high concentration of arsenic, and the only way we can reduce that is to sort of widely distribute it and sort of water it down, so to speak. So what happens in a situation like that where you have to start to bank on arsenic-laden water for our potable water system?
Well, that's a question for the water utility, and I don't know, Rick may have stepped, oh, there's Rick.
Yeah, I was going to speak to it if you have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Rick Sheenwater, Quality Hydrologist with the Water Utility Authority. I mean, we have the capacity within the system. We always have redundancy. I mean, short term, 1 well goes down, 2 wells go down. We can supplement it with what, you know, surface water diversions we have. Really depends on which well is taken out of service. We also have wells that, as you said, are higher in arsenic, but we can also operate in a situation where the demand, what we do when we need to operate in high demand is to treat the wells that do have arsenic and include that water into the system. I mean, so we do have redundancy. We do have some overlapping, but with that said, I mean, it was our plan to shut off water if we got a detect in a production well, not use it in the potable system, and certainly start with, you know, drilling another well in another location. We already have an asset management plan and replacement well plan, so we already have the locations we would put in new wells. It may not answer your question, but I'll speak with the gentleman and also be available in the breakout sessions.
And we've been down this road before in the San Jose area, which is on Broadway by Woodward. The city lost 2 supply wells there in 1980, and they had to be abandoned. And there were at least 7 different cleanups of LNAPL, DNAPL, and it's a really pretty nasty contamination area, and they had to replace wells.
That's G?
Yes. G, and there's fuel plants down there. We had fuel floating on the water table. We had chlorinated solvents that are denser than water sinking down in, and we have about a square mile of contamination. And that's been under cleanup since the 1980s.
1 square mile there, how many square miles here?
The footprint of this plume is about 1/4 of a square mile. Just to put it in perspective, we have a plume in Hobbs of crude oil where 20 million gallons had been skimmed off of LNAPL, had been pulled out of the groundwater from people's private domestic wells and sold.
Does that have ethyl hydromine?
No, it's crude oil, but it has benzene. And the footprint is about 5 square miles on that one.
Yes, my name's Eric Nuttall, former faculty with the University of New Mexico and a stakeholder on this. I would like to suggest a couple of ideas and enhancements. First of all, when you have your plumes and you talk about the wells and so on that are going in, it would be very helpful if all that was in 3 dimensions. And the software and the capability of doing that, I think, is going to make it a lot easier for people to grasp in a short period of time that don't work with this day in and day out. So, you know, it's quite a few wells, and they're nested, and it's pretty confusing. So the ethylene dibromide plume, if you could make that in 3 dimensions, you could partition it and show the different numbers for the amount of ethylene dibromide in the system, and I would encourage you to share with us mass numbers, and particularly in how you're progressing with remediation. And then sort of combined finally is, in the case of the pump and treat, it looks wonderful on paper and collapsing the plume like all pump and treat systems do. But the findings after having done that for 30 or 40 years now, and EPA supports this, is that pump and treat seldom meets its MCL goals. And for various reasons, you have to pump forever. And in this case, you're down to a very low MCL of 50 parts per trillion. Plus you have clay lenses, as Dennis so adroitly pointed out, that gives you what's called back diffusion, which really adds to this continuous bleeding to get down to those kinds of levels. So my suggestion in that regard kind of is twofold. One, this system that you're putting in is a great idea on paper, but I really think it needs to be run through the modeling and the cost analysis and cost benefit to be sure that your treatment system over there at the Air Force Base is really robust, is really cost effective, how long you're going to have to pump and treat to meet these conditions, and so on. And right now in RECRA, why you have an RFI is basically data collection, and you're still in the RFI is my understanding. And these interim measures ideas are encouraging because you're on fast track. I understand you want to get things done, no question. You want to show that you're doing your best foot forward. But there is a caution to that, and really that's why in RECRA, from thousands or hundreds of sites, they've learned that you do the RFI and then you do go into the corrective measure in studies and investigations so that you really have all of the information in hand. So it's a little premature to be banking to the public that pump and treat is going to do it, is my sort of take-home message, without a feasibility and cost and simulation study.
Good points. I'll look at my boss on buying some visual mod flow software. Be a good idea. And you know, I think we're at the point now, and we know the pros and cons of pump and treat.
Correct.
You know, it's slow, but we have this plume that's under a residential area, and our options are very limited, and it's at 500 feet. This is a really challenging site. It's not like some of the sites in the South Valley where we've had 7 feet of El Napo, gotten clean closure from skimming, sparging, venting, pumping, and treating. This is a really difficult site. But we're at the point now where we think we need to move forward, and collapsing this plume seems like the best option. We don't have perfect data, and that's what that option C that Mr. Correll pointed out. And the water utility is behind that. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the water utility, and we hope with this community that this is the best option. We don't have perfect data, but we need to move forward now.
Hi, I'm Mark Soller from UNM. I'm a grad student in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department, working in hydrology. My question is bringing back with regards to your idea of helping the bacteria or accelerating the effects of the bacteria. If you move forward with finding ways to accelerate and the bacterial action and growth, are there any concerns with regard to the bacteria themselves becoming a problem unto themselves? For example, algae in a surface water system can be a very beneficial thing, but if you add too much fertilizer or nitrates, you end up with algae blooms, which can become disastrous for the system that's being affected. Is there the possibility that the bacteria that you're thinking of helping along to grow and accelerate could become a problem themselves?
Yes. I mean, I'm going to answer that quickly and just say, yes, there is problems with it. If you get overgrowth, they can biofoul your system. And so one of the early on problems when we implemented this technology is we would dump way too much pizza down the well, and everything started to clog on us, and we had trouble with recirculation or distribution of that pizza down that well. So what I would say is that from those lessons learned, we know there's some strategies that we can do and concentrations to minimize that. And we know what we can do if we start to see those signs, early warning signs, if that started to happen to us, so that we could back off the system and how it functions.
And there's some evidence that there's already some biofouling from the intrinsic biodegradation.
Okay, so we'll take this question over here, and then the other remaining 3 people standing, and then we'll end the question and answer session after those next 3 people. And our technical staff will be available across the hall in the classroom to continue discussions if you want to continue those over there. So we'll take the last 4.
Yes, I was wondering what kind of filtration you're looking at.
For the treating of the EDB, it is granulated activated carbon. It is basically coconut shells that will absorb the contaminant to it.
So would microfiltration be a better option? And is it not going to be used because it would be more expensive? Or do you think that the option you're talking about is the best option?
Microfiltration is very good at treating low, contaminants to very low levels, especially trickier contaminants like endocrine disrupting compounds that you come out of a wastewater treatment facility. Microfiltration has been used a lot in that industry. It is inexpensive, and it has a lot of maintenance issues from clogging properties. We are expecting in this extraction to have high dissolved solids and particulates, so we're even going to have bags to remove those particulates before we treat it through our GAC system. The reason why we chose GAC is it is a proven technology to treat EB to below detection, non-detection limits.
And we in Santa Fe have been drinking treated water for about 2 decades. We had a city well that was contaminated with benzene and with EDB, and a air stripper and carbon system was put in, and we have had no detections entering. It goes directly into the city water supply, not into the groundwater, because of the water situation up there. And we've had not one detection coming out of that activated carbon system going into our drinking water. It's not something we take lightly, because we live in these communities too.
Well, Santa Fe does have a microfiltration for the river water.
That's the Buckman, but this is the Santa Fe well. We're using an air stripper and carbon in series.
And so my question is this the very best system that could be used, or would microfiltration take out more EDB from the water? Or are you convinced that this is the very best filtration? And have you compared the two, or is there a comparison?
Carbon works really great. It indiscriminately removes all organic contaminants. And it's tried and true. There are disposal issues with the carbon, but it is a really effective and very safe method. If you want 0 contaminants in your drinking water, I would recommend carbon.
Okay, well, my experience has been a little different from that, and this is my experience. I deal a lot with radioactive elements, and so Santa Fe generally has about 24 picocuries per liter in their drinking water, even though they're right below where the Los Alamos canyons discharge the plutonium into the river water. Whereas in my neighborhood, I have 38 picocuries per liter of plutonium in our drinking water, and it's gone up. And so we're looking at the difference there between the carbon sand in Albuquerque and the microfiltration in Santa Fe.
Yeah, well, the technology used to remove uranium and radionuclides is very different from the technology that you use to remove gasoline. I think that's what you're getting at.
Okay, so once again, so has there been any testing between the two things on EDB to see if micro is better than sand and carbon?
There have been no bench scale tests. We're absolutely confident carbon is going to work.
Dennis, can I add?
Sure.
Microfiltration removes particulates. Activated carbon removes dissolved organics. This microfiltration will not remove EDB.
Okay, thank you.
Dave McCoy, Citizen Action. I'm concerned about the overall lack of coordination here in terms of the RCRA process. It kind of reminds me of a subdivision being built where the houses are put in and then they worry about the electricity and the water supply and septic later. With respect to the term collapse, semantically, I don't know where that term came from. It sounds real good, makes a good soundbite, but it really doesn't grasp this situation here. I have a question about the earlier extraction wells that were proposed by the contractor and to the NMAD. Whatever happened to those, and why aren't they being used? There is a question about how much water are you really going to be processing down the road with pump and treat technology. With respect to the air sparging that's been approved, seems a little premature to me in terms of the fact that LNAPL and EDB tend to be non-volatile, and it's well known in the literature that EDB can be spread with air sparging technology, and also you create an aerobic condition which is contraindicated for that. So that's a question in my mind. A question was asked about the worst case for the aquifer, and I don't think that was really effectively answered. And certainly there's been no consideration of the economic effect overall on the city if you have to start shutting down wells and that sort of remedy. And right now, I think the Air Force should begin considering what are those costs going to be, and they should bear those costs, not the ratepayers. With respect to the detection limits being at 10 parts per trillion, I think it's misleading to show these maps that have wells off to the west, and they're all put at 29 parts per trillion, and then you've got undetect next to them. What is the actual detection that we're seeing? So those are some of my concerns.
Okay, well, let me start answering your questions. We think collapsing the plume is a great analogy here. It's a term that in the visualization we had, this is what we plan to do. You asked so many questions, I've kind of lost them. We are...
Look up there.
Oh, okay. The earlier wells the contractor proposed to install. Those extraction wells were going to be located in the middle of the plume between the LNAPL source and the remainder of the dissolved EDB. It would have cut the plume in half. And it was decided by everybody, the state, the Air Force, and the water utility, that was not a good idea at that time. Right or wrong, that was the decision that was made. This is a completely different design. We have not seen an aggressive proposal like this, to go in all the way to the edge of the plume, collapse it, and pull it back. It is a totally different design, and it's very aggressive, and we're going to keep this plume out of the city water supply wells. The Air Force is committed to that. My boss has given me that as my assignment. We're going to keep it out of there. So the detection limits aren't going to matter. The EPA prescribed limits, you can look them up on the website. The actual quantitation limit, you can detect things lower than you can quantify, and we can talk about those limits, but we're pushing the edges of analytical chemistry as it is with .01. How much water are we going to be processing? We're going to be looking at about 600 gallons per minute
600 to 800.
total. That's with all 8 extraction wells running to collapse this plume and pull it back. Shutting the wells down, I think Rick, if he's still here, should address that and the costs. Worst case scenario, there's a whole bunch of pollution from other sources all over the city, north side, south side, west side, we haven't discovered yet, and we shut down wells. You know, when humans live on top of groundwater aquifers, we have septic systems, we have gas tanks, we have fertilizers. Some of that stuff gets in our drinking water, and this is just the way it is. And I don't really want to speculate beyond that. But we're going to keep this stuff out of the water supply wells.
You answered it all.
Hello, my name is Bridget Yanis, and I'm with the International District Healthy Communities Coalition. So I'm a resident of the International District, and I'm here representing some of the families that live on top of the well. I guess I have a lot of clarifying questions, because you said a lot of things I just wanted to make clear. So the plume is 500 feet all the way through the plume? Is there certain parts that are 500 feet? How is that depth measured?
Okay. The depth of the plume is from the surface to where the groundwater is. For the EDB portion is 500 feet or greater. It depends on where you are. Sometimes it's 490, sometimes it's 500, 510, but it's in that range. Okay, so there's a vast, and if this helps from an analogy perspective, the tallest building downtown is the Plaza One. That's 351 feet high. So we're talking about quite almost double that. That's how far down the contamination is below the community you're talking about.
Okay. And so along with that then, what community members are wanting to know is it safe to plant things that you eat, like vegetables, if you're living on top of this plume?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the risk assessment experts from Atlanta associated with the Centers for Disease Control came out and looked for exposure pathways. These are pathways where EDB or benzene could come in contact with humans. And they did not, that was not even on their radar screen.
Okay. So have there been any kind of health assessments or anything like that that are offered to the residents? I mean, because if this has been under the ground for, I don't know, since the 50s, I mean, I'm curious what kind of effect this has had. I mean, I hear that it's 500 feet down, but it's still super toxic substances. So I'm wondering if there have been any health assessments, if any health assessments have been offered to the residents who live on top of the plume.
Well, the thing that's working in our favor is that the benzene is the only thing that's really an issue for diffusing into buildings or anything like that. The EDB is so soluble in water, it's still volatile, but not very much. It would much rather be in the water. And so once you get beyond that hydrocarbon plume right around the base, all you've got is EDB in the groundwater, and that is not very volatile. So we just don't see an exposure pathway, and neither did the experts from Atlanta, for diffusion into houses or into vegetable gardens.
Okay, thank you.
And our last question over here.
I hope a very simple one. I'm Jeff Schlaer. I'm on the Siesta Hills Neighborhood Association. I'm an officer with the Neighborhood Association. I'm also on the board of that Methodist church there. And my question is, where exactly is that phase 1 extraction well?
We're going to
It's
show you.
obviously in the alleyway.
It is.
Is it behind the condominiums, in which case the neighborhood association is going to whine because that would block driveway or actually block garages? If it's behind the eastern or the western part of the church or the playground at the church, that's also going to create some whining. If it's to the east of there, we probably don't care.
I'm with CB&I. We actually just sited that well today, so I'd be more than happy to talk to you in the breakout session to show you where it is
Sure.
relative to the church. We sited it with the goal of minimizing how many driveways and garages would be impacted, and we think that we've been able to minimize that to a large extent. So I can show you on the map exactly where it is.
Great.
And since you know the church, I can show you a picture.
I'll do that.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much for your questions, and I really appreciate the attendance tonight. As I said, we will continue the conversation